All right, friends, this is day 35, and today we're just going to look at the last verse of the story we've been looking at this week, which is the last verse, verse 54 of chapter 4. And then from there, we'll use that as kind of a jumping off point to reflect on, in some ways, where we've been all along. So here's what that verse says. This was the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. So the second signs, we've talked about signs some. So there end up being 7 signs. There's some controversy about how exactly you count the signs. We'll get into that later. In fact, even on our teaching team for this, there's some disagreement about the best way to count those. So we'll get into that later. But this is definitely the second one of those. This healing of this man's son. The first one was the wedding at the Cana of Galilee. That's kind of a through line that we'll track throughout John, so just keep that in mind. Another through line that we're going to track are these I am statements. We talked about that last week. Jesus reveals himself to the Samaritan woman by saying, I am Messiah. We're going to see more of those also. And here's one that is a little bit more buried, that's super important. Where did this story take place? The one that we've been reading this week? It took place in Cana of Galilee. We saw that back up in verse 46. Where else have we seen Cana of Galilee? Well, we saw it all the way back in chapter 2 when Jesus turned the water into the wine. So the first sign took place in Cana also. Having Cana there and having Cana here are bookends that really hold this part of John together. Between that Cana and this Cana, what are the things that we saw? We saw Jesus engaging with people at a wedding. We saw Jesus engaging with people at the temple. We saw Jesus engaging with a rabbi. And we saw Jesus engaging with a woman at a well. Those four symbols, those four things that I just referenced, the well, the rabbi, the temple, and the wedding are all 4 really important Jewish symbols. So Jesus, in the way that John tells the story of Jesus, Jesus is engaging with these 4 important Jewish symbols. And what's happening? Well, what's happening is that Jesus is becoming the fulfillment of what these symbols represent. Jesus is not replacing these symbols. He's not doing away with Judaism, but he's building on it and fulfilling it. We talked about this if you were with us back in Matthew, that Jesus doesn't do away with the Old Testament and with Judaism. He fulfills it. He builds on top of it. It's as if the mountain that is Judaism, it's not that he tears it down and rebuilds a new mountain. It's that he builds more on top of this mountain. So look at what's happening at the wedding. At the wedding, a wedding is where people come together, where families come together, and 2 families become 1 family. Well, in Jesus, that's what happens. We see it even with the Samaritans and the Jews. Jesus bringing them back together. But eventually what Jesus wants to do is to bring all of God's people together. What happens at the temple? Well, the temple is the place of healing, the place of forgiveness. Well, what does Jesus become? Jesus becomes the one sacrifice, the place of healing, the place of forgiveness. What happens with the rabbi? Well, the rabbis were the source of teaching. They were the ones who interpreted the scripture. Well, Jesus now becomes the great teacher, the center point of that teaching, of the way in which we can understand the Old Testament in light of what God is doing now. He becomes the focal point of that teaching. And then what happens at the well? Well, at the well, it's not only that symbol of marriage, which we've already talked about, but it's also that place in which the water, the nourishment that we need in life is found. And Jesus talks there about living water. So what is it? It's in Jesus that we find the true life that we're looking for. It's beautiful the way that John puts this together. So between these 2 experiences in Cana, it's where we find out about how it is that Jesus is fulfilling all of this imagery from the Old Testament. Remember what the initial question is. The initial question from the beginning of all of this is, what are you looking for? And what we're beginning to see is that Jesus is the answer to the question, what are you looking for, no matter what it is that you're looking for. And what we see here is that this story that we've looked at this week is a bit of a hinge story. Because what we're going to see next is that we see 4 more scenes that take place at Jewish festivals. So we've got the Jewish symbols, now we've got the Jewish festivals. This is kind of the hinge in between. And what's right at the middle? This man took Jesus at his word and departed. He just believed what Jesus was saying and went on believing, trusting that one day he would actually see. And he does see, and his belief goes to a whole other level. But at that point in the story, he just had to trust. And at this point in the story of John, we just have to trust. We have to trust that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the things in the Old Testament, and he's the fulfillment of the question that we've been asking, what is it that we are looking for? He's the fulfillment of that. And if we stick with it, we take him at his word, then one day we'll see the fulfillment of that. And in fact, even beginning next week, we're going to begin seeing the fulfillment of some of that in this story, and I hope that you'll begin to see the fulfillment of that in your life also. So I just want to revisit the question from the very beginning today. Let me ask you again. What is it that you're looking for? What are you looking for? And can you take Jesus at his word, like this man did, and trust that if you come in that you see, that you'll find that he really is what we're looking for. God bless you, friends, and we'll see you next week.